good news all over the place. I got my last 3 submissions of books received by CGC a few days ago. There'll be no updates on those today because it's Sunday. But, found out through a Bull Birdie about pirateship.com, which is cheaper shipping than stamps. And then eliminate all life in the universe. And that's exactly what's happening. The Guardians of the Universe, some of the most powerful beings in existence, knew about the prophecy of Blackest Night. They believed the prophecy of Blackest Night was fear-mongering. It was an attempt to strip Green Lanterns of their power by instilling in them this belief that the universe would come to an end and all these Lantern Corps would rise. And in doing so, Green Lanterns would cease to be as powerful as they once were, paving the way for almost any number of other villains to rise to power. Now, because of that, when Sinestro Corps War popped off, and in the aftermath of Sinestro Corps War, once we got into Infinite Crisis and those storylines, and once the Black Lanterns started to rise, the Guardians of the Universe kind of looked around and said, well, I guess they were right. Okay. Because a couple of the Guardians, they gambit and say, here we go. The prophecy was going to come into existence. And so in order to prepare for it, they created the try to tag Daniel. The fact remains here that in the presence of all these Black Lanterns, nope, still doesn't want me to tag him. We basically did issues 1 through 4 and then stopped and started doing tie-ins. The reason for that is because everything that we're covering right now in terms of these tie-ins, really, until I say otherwise, this is all taking place during the first 4 issues of Blackest Night. The other half of this is that almost everybody is encountering this in their own way at the outset. The Green Lantern Corps is encountering all this stuff at the outset. Hal Jordan and those guys are on Earth, they're encountering it. John Stewart is actually just sort of pondering the nature of the mistakes he's made when it came to the planet of Xanthi. Dang it, I didn't fix my dang thing. DC published a story called Cosmic Odyssey. It's a 4-part series, and it was change my title. A really weird story written by Jim Starlin, but it basically detailed this idea that there was just some being called Xanthi, more or less, that it split itself into 4 parts and it had gone to 4 different planets. But the idea was that John Stewart was a relatively new and pretty reckless Green Lantern when he was younger, and the result was that he teamed up with Martian Manhunter to try to find a way to basically keep Xanthi from being destroyed due to the fact that if 2 of these planets were obliterated, the universe would be destroyed in its entirety. He basically screwed up, ran headlong into it, found this giant bomb in the middle of the planet, was too late to save it, and everybody on the planet died. Now, the funny thing about John Stewart is that he is basically a Green Lantern that did not initially rise to any real significant measure of popularity until Justice League came out in 2001. He was introduced 30 years earlier, in 1970. He basically served as a backup character throughout the entirety of the Green Lantern run, running all the way up through Emerald Twilight. He had involvement in all those stories, 0 Hour, Crisis in Time, and so on and so forth, up until Green Lantern Rebirth, which is where he began to increase in popularity even more among comic book readers, just because of the fact that his popularity in Justice League, the cartoon show, and then Green Lantern Rebirth basically set him to one of the higher echelons of characters. But the idea here is that because of the fact that Xanthi was a planet to be obliterated, what this does is it basically tells us that there is no limit to what it is that the Black Lantern rings can resurrect. They can recreate anything. Xanthi itself is resurrected as an entire planet to serve the purpose of operating alongside the Black Lanterns. Now, this will eventually go into like John Stewart's own sub-story that will lead into the Black Lantern story and actually see if we can. I really like the spikes that I'm putting on him. It's got like spiked knuckles, huh? Like brass knuckles, spiked brass knuckles. He's gonna have a kind of a cool hunting face. I changed his hand. You can see based on the gloss where his hand used to be and what I did with it. So made it just a little spikier, a little more cool. Long fingers. Thanks for everybody who donated to me to get some more pens and other equipment and stuff. I have a new camera already on the way, which is great, and so I'll have 2 cameras going now, which might be a little bit hard on my graphics card, but I might have a solution for that too. Because graphics cards, I don't know if you noticed, but they are expensive as hell, the last few years, because I'm not exactly sure why they raised their price so much. Some scheme.
Some scheme of some kind, I'm sure. To raise the price of graphics cards.
And then that led into the whole skirmish of the Green Lantern showing up, Sinestro being captured, so on and so forth. In an effort to basically try to turn Lyra away from being a Red Lantern, because of the fact that the original Green Lantern, while Hal Jordan was trying to leave him, Hal Jordan eventually became a Red Lantern and things like that. But this all basically goes towards this idea that the Sinestro Corps itself was experiencing what amounted to a civil war, in the sense that you had Val Sinestro, who had finally been captured by the Green Lanterns and was being held prisoner. While that was going on, a villain named Mongo, who is by and large as strong, if not stronger than Superman, depending on what stories you're reading, was given a Yellow Lantern ring himself, and then basically co-opted leadership of the Sinestro Corps and took it over in Sinestro's absence. And so what you basically had were members of the Sinestro Corps who were loyal to Mongo and those who were loyal to Sinestro. The result was that when everything popped off and when everything started going to pot and it all started going wrong, Sinestro made his escape. He was out. He grabbed those who were faithful and then tracked down the Star Sapphires, which leads us here. Now, the reason why he's here for these Star Sapphires is because of the fact that these Star Sapphires are based on love. And so what they did is they took a whole bunch of members of the Sinestro Corps and they started putting them in these crystals of sorts that would basically convert them to Star Sapphires. Sinestro showing up here simply serves the purpose of grabbing, his members of the Sinestro Corps, bringing them back, and then eventually going back, killing Mongol, and then taking back over his Sinestro Corps. Again, with this idea of the Red Lanterns transitioning back to Gizmo, this is still the aftermath of all this stuff. Lyra's still dead, the Green Lanterns are still trying to make their escape and dealing with the Red Lanterns themselves, and then suddenly Black Lantern rings just start descending on everyone. So again, that's why there's so much back and forth here. That's why there's so much jumping around, is because we're talking about a war across the universe with these Black Lantern rings seemingly showing up out of nowhere. Now, the other half of this is that Star Sapphires effectively have the ability to tap into the emotions of people by way of love. And an attempt that's made by Carol Ferris, who was formerly a lover of Hal Jordan, the first Star Sapphire, and then ultimately rechristened with the Star Sapphire again, is that she had actually encased Sinestro in this crystal of love, more or less, and tried to convert him, or tried to begin the process of converting him. Now, under normal circumstances, what happens is that if a person's not powerful enough, when they're encased in crystal, they'll basically just kind of begin to shut down and go into a...
Is yours, boo? No, this is Daniel Daly's. Doesn't let me tag Daniel, or I would tag him, but he knows. He's probably watching. He doesn't comment a lot. This is the same person who got the toxin on the last book.
Now, the problem with this is that in the middle of their skirmish, much like the skirmish between the Red Lanterns and the Green Lanterns and all that stuff, we're basically met with the arrival.
So they're going to be brothers. They're going to be brothers. They're going to sit next to each other.
It's because this is basically all these different groups in the middle of their ongoing conflicts, basically in the middle of this war of life.
I want to see my children getting along. Oh, this is going to be sick. This is Jonathan Beebe. Yeah, I think this one's going to look sweet.
They effectively have this governing rule in the sense that only those who are able to overcome great fear can become Green Lanterns. Only those who are basically able to manipulate fear and use that fear to empower themselves can become Corps members and so forth. Larfleeze is not like any of the other Corps. Larfleeze is the Orange Lantern of greed, of avarice. And so the idea is that he has the whole of the Lantern Corps power to himself, which makes him insane in terms of the kind of things that he can do. But the idea here is that because the Blue Lanterns were so intriguing to Larfleeze, when the opportunity arose, which we had covered previously, for him to basically capture the Blue Lanterns, when he was introduced to the idea that they exist, he basically took all of his constructs and just sent them all directly to the Blue Lanterns themselves. Now, that's the inherent difference between Larfleeze as an Orange Lantern and everybody else. All the other Lantern Corps have multiple members: the Blue Lanterns, the Red Lanterns, the Green Lanterns, Yellow Lanterns. But with Larfleeze, his Corps consists of constructs. Anyone he's ever killed becomes a construct. They become something for him to control. The problem with this is that, again, with Larfleeze having killed so many people, his base of operations is a giant graveyard. It means when Black Lantern rings start descending on the Larfleeze base of operations, it's nothing but Black Lantern to start rising anywhere. It's just him by himself. But his power is extreme, and we'll actually find out just how powerful he is in the next few videos or so. But the idea is that, again, this is why the Blue Lanterns are fighting the Orange Lanterns.
I'm going to have to try a new pen here. This thing's really cheesing me off.
here is that with this flow of light going on, with the Black Lantern strategy themselves, what it does is it begins to shift its focus to the idea of an integrated.
Then I got a whole bag of them.
Picking up with the Green Lantern 4 minus 4, just to say all the other Green Lanterns that are out there minus the idea is that in the aftermath of the story called Emerald Eclipse. Now, Emerald Eclipse isn't having really good people agency.
I swear, man, I go through like 1.5, 2 pens a day. Sometimes. That's these pens are expensive. They're like almost over $3 each. Let's see. $5 a day. 360. Let's say 300 days out of the year. No, more than that. Well, give myself a couple days off. And that's quite a bit, huh? $1,500 a year. So I'm really spending like $120 a month on pens almost. It's pretty fucked up. TBH. Ah, now that's the color I'm looking for right there.
All these different races that exist out there, and so on and so forth. The problem with that, when this explorer was discovered, he was basically taken, killed, and snuffed by the Daxons themselves. This created an absolute hatred for his own ways and their xenophobic views at the hands of Sonya. In response to this, when he was given the opportunity to become a Green Lantern, he immediately took it. Now, he became significant in the Green Lantern mythos for 2 reasons. The first is because it was believed that if someone like Superman ever became a Green Lantern, they'd be the most powerful lantern in existence, because it's basically the powers of Superman combined with the powers of a lantern. So that would be hitherto almost unchecked powers. The other half of this is that he was destined to become the new Ion. When DC originally launched the events of Emerald Twilight and 0 Hour Crisis in Time, Hal Jordan became possessed by Parallax, that kind of good stuff, he eliminated almost the entirety of the Green Lantern Corps. Kyle Rayner basically became a being called Ion, which basically allowed him to house the entity, in the sense that he was basically able to single-handedly resurrect the entirety of the Green Lanterns. That's what the Ion entity is. Should all the Green Lanterns be killed, the Ion can bring them all back. He can basically bring back the Guardians and the Central Power Battery and all that kind of stuff. The whole idea is that because
that's hacks.
So powerful, during the events of Mongol running the Sinestro Corps, he basically invaded the planet of Daxon. Sotomyad intervened, and in the midst of it all, basically took the Red Sun, or flew himself into the Red Sun, and then used his own energies and converted it into a Yellow Sun, gave all of his people Superman powers, and they fought off the Sinestro Corps. And that's basically it. That's the gist of it. But the idea is that he was believed to have been left for dead. He was believed to have died. Now, he didn't, and he'll come back during the events of Brightest Day. But at the time, he was believed to have been gone, and it allowed DC to put him on the back burner. But while there isn't a whole lot of meat and potatoes to the Green Lantern Corps story, what this basically does, or at least in terms of this story, is it deals with the idea that with these Black Lantern rings descending on all these different people, everybody's having to deal with it in their own way. For the character of Kyle Rayner, he basically sees this sort of reincarnation of the character Jade, the daughter of the Green Lantern Alan Scott, who Kyle Rayner had been in love with and who had ultimately died. Because of the fact that Jade, alongside almost all the other girlfriends that he's had, have all perished in tragic circumstances, it's a haunting of Kyle Rayner. That's one of the reasons why he never really gets into relationships, or if he does, it's going to get quote unquote stuffed in a refrigerator. That's the big concern that goes on in his mind when it comes to other people. The other half of this is it actually shows how sadistic the Black Lanterns are, in the sense that they actually bust into a infirmary for the most part, where all these Green Lanterns are healing from various injuries and conflicts they've been in, and they literally go in and just start tearing out their hearts. I mean, it's pretty intense in terms of what it is that they end up doing. But again, this is the first appearance of the Black Lantern ring to a vast majority of the Green Lantern Corps. So again, it's pretty cool in terms of how it all unfolds. But jumping back to Sinestro, jumping back to the Black Lanterns, the fact that these Black Lanterns are basically emerging, 2 of the most important ones come in the form of Aaron Soar and Aaron Soar. Now, Aaron Soar was at one time the only person that Sinestro had actually loved. And Sarah Natu is the daughter of Aaron Soar and Sinestro himself. We would have thought during the events.
Yes, sir. I was going to do yours next, Martin, but I wanted to do these 2 one after the other just because they're for the same person. Sure, that makes sense.
All these different people they come across to feel fear or rage or whatever the case may be, and those emotions charge up that person's heart. And when that person's heart is charged, the black lanterns take their hearts, consume them, and all that energy feeds the central power battery. The reason why that's important is because when the central power battery is at 100%, the entity that represents the black lantern core is Necron himself, and it will allow him to enter the realm of the living. That's why this is a huge deal. And so again, that's why this is so huge, is because in the middle of this all, the Indigo tribe finally steps in. And the whole goal here is for them to essentially be the voice of reason, the voice of logic. And they will be the ones who will basically come together and say, we have to unite the Lantern Corps against the Blackest Night. We cannot let them down, because if we do, then what this will do is it will basically live up to the prophecy. And so with that in mind, the Indigo tribe, Indigo 1, at least the leader of the Indigo tribe, basically grabs Sinestro and takes him directly to Mongol, because the whole idea here is to eliminate Mongol and reunite the Sinestro Corps, because they need every single living member of every single Lantern Corps and more to defeat the Black Lanterns. It's a coming together of every living being in existence to fight off against the Black Lanterns and have it come to a head in a massive battle. Thal Sinestro is just one with his own Lantern Corps. He knows how to use it the way that nobody else does. Mongol is just this heavy hitter. He's just this slugger. That's really all it is. He's really, really smart and he's very capable, but he's not a master of the Sinestro Corps. Sinestro actually overpowers and eliminates Mongol right off the bat. And so what this does is it basically leads into this idea that we're going to see the return of the Sinestro Corps, and we're eventually going to see a continued call to arms. All these Lantern Corps coming together to join the Earth superheroes and face off against the Black Lantern Corps, which will ultimately lead into the rise of the White Lanterns. Okay, so continuing our discussions on Blackest Night, at this point we pick up with the second part, and this focuses partly on the Green Lantern Corps and the second half on the Green Lantern title itself. Again, much like we did in the previous video. Now, in the last video, we had basically dealt with this idea that there were two things happening in the universe at the same time. I mean, the Black Lantern rings are basically these rings that attach themselves to those who have been deceased, and they resurrect them for the purpose of emotionally charging other individuals, so that when those individuals' hearts are just filled with all different types of emotions, the Black Lantern takes their heart, consumes it, and it feeds their central power battery, charging it up to 100%. Now, the idea here is that in the last video, we basically mentioned that the Black Lantern rings basically spreading throughout the universe was a massive calamity, because what it meant is that individuals who had died across the universe were being resurrected, no matter what planet they were on, and we even saw entire planets being resurrected by the Black Lantern rings. Now, of course, all this goes towards the entity of Necron, which is to say, in the DC universe, when it comes to the emotional spectrum, you've got entities that represent those spectrums. They're not really gods. They're really more just kind of like avatars. And so Necron is kind of this living embodiment of death, so to speak. But the idea here
What is the difference between a god and an avatar exactly?
Power battery 100%, so that it will basically open a gateway and allow Necron to enter the living realm. And all of this is important because of the fact that this feeds into the War of Light, feeds into the rise of the Black Lanterns. All these Lantern Corps going to war against one another. While that's happening, the Black Lanterns rising to prominence, ultimately eliminating all life in existence, and then ushering in this basically Blackest Night, this eternal darkness in the universe. And so with the Green Lantern Corps, this again focuses on basically everybody except for Hal Jordan, the main Green Lantern, quote unquote, in the DC universe. And so we basically end up picking up with like Sarana Kanatu and these characters. And we had talked about how the Black Lanterns were really sadistic because they would basically kill anybody. In this instance, it was the Black Lanterns going to the infirmary of the Green Lantern Corps, and then with those individuals who were effectively injured or who were basically unable to defend themselves, the Black Lanterns would terrify them, and when their hearts were charged, they would just seize them and take their hearts out of their bodies. They were basically killing helpless people. So it's pretty insane in terms of how that unfolds. But again, that becomes significant because it's like classic zombie infection. The more zombies there are, the more zombies there become. Because the Black Lanterns, once they kill someone, a Black Lantern ring suddenly bonds to that person, and the numbers bolster even further.
What?
It's a continuation of the idea that the Green Lantern Corps is
That doesn't make any
the
sense.
realization that the dead are rising in the form of Black Lanterns, and the goal is to get as many people out there as they possibly can. The problem with this is that each individual are dealing with the Black Lanterns in their own individual way. Now, this is
Dummy man wants to take care of customers.
She's basically the top medic, the top doctor of the Green Lantern.
How could you have ever failed me?
Being killed
You failed me.
is her own way of basically having to deal with it, being confronted by the Black Lantern concept.
I try to do a good job on all my pieces. Some of them are
Rage, with fear,
not my favorite.
powers, and so forth.
Enough
And they try
talking
to take her out as well. But what had happened over the course of the
Let's
Green
talk about the
Lantern
winners.
line of stories by Peter Tomasi this idea that a kind of affection was brewing between Serana Natu and Kyle Rayner as a Green Lantern. Now, in all honesty, this just made good sense. It's basically this idea that a lot of the girlfriends of Kyle Rayner were like, heroic, or they were very virtuous. But with Serana Natu, she basically possesses all those character traits. She's headstrong, she's brave, she's got the drive where it counts, she's got ambition. Her goal is to be one of the greatest Green Lanterns. And so it was basically Peter J. Tomasi coming along and saying, we're going to introduce a love interest between Kyle Rayner and Serana Natu, but she's not going to go out the same way as everybody else. The cool thing about this is that with Kyle Rayner's most recent girlfriend, a girl by the name of Jade, who was basically the daughter of the Green Lantern Alan Scott, what happened is that she essentially sacrificed her life in order to save Kyle Rayner, also imbued him with something called the Starheart, which is basically a version of the Green Lantern energy from a different reality. And the idea here was that it helped to bolster the powers of Kyle Rayner, went towards him being ion. We talked about that in the previous video. But the long and short of this is that Jade had basically been resurrected by a Black Lantern. And much like all the Black Lanterns that we've seen so far, their goal is emotional manipulation. Feed on their emotional state, whatever relationship they have, charge their hearts with energy, and then take their heart when it's filled with emotion. Jade had initially appeared to Kyle Rayner as, hey, it's okay that I passed, that's the way things go, but we can be together again. And this kind of hope, this Blue Lantern energy of hope filled Kyle Rayner. There was also willpower. There was also the belief that maybe things can work out. But it was really Kyle Rayner putting on a ruse, that he was playing along with Jade to understand the motivations of what the Black Lanterns were looking for. And that's when Kyle Rayner came to the realization the Black Lanterns are looking to charge people's hearts with emotion and then consume them. Now, in the middle of all this, because Jade had such an emotional and psychological impact on Kyle Rayner, it takes the intervention of Serana Natu to sort of snap Kyle Rayner out completely, in the sense that he's aware of what it is that Jade's doing, but his heart can't help but feel that maybe they can be together again. Now, of course, again, Serana Natu has no stake in Jade. She doesn't know Jade. She's never met Jade. And so Serana Natu is the voice of reason here. She's the one who essentially kind of defies it all and jumps into the fray. Now, the other half of this are characters like Kilowog, right? For Kilowog, he doesn't really have a whole lot of emotional attachments to other people that are out there. For him, he's the drill sergeant of the Green Lantern Corps. He's very militaristic in that fashion. And so for him, it's honor and duty above all else. But as the drill sergeant for the Green Lantern, every single Green Lantern that dies feels like it's the fault of Kilowog. And that's what the Black Lanterns feed on in his case. It's this idea. All these different Black Lanterns out here that were formerly Green Lanterns who died in the line of duty, they wouldn't have died if you'd done your job like you were supposed to. And that's what fills him with rage. Because remember, no matter what any of these Green Lantern Corps members feel, the Black Lanterns will feed on it. But one of the darkest moments comes from out of this, and we basically find out that the children of Crain have all come back as Black Lanterns. Now, Crain was a character who was, I believe, originally introduced in the Sinestro Corps. But Crain was basically this weird alien entity that essentially went on this pattern of killing Green Lanterns and then taking their children and making the children her own. Now, she wasn't like abusing them or anything. She would just take them, whisk them off to some planet somewhere and say, you are now my children. But the idea is that for whatever reason that hasn't been explained yet, these kids have all basically died. Now, this can largely be due to be attributed to the fact that Craig was the only one taking care of these kids. And with Craig basically having been captured by the Green Lanterns and then allowed to go with these Zamorons, the Star Sapphires, these kids were just kind of left to their own devices and ultimately ended up just perishing according to the environment. But the problem is that in the middle of all this, we end up having the arrival of one of the Indigo Lanterns. Now again, when it comes to the Black Lanterns, the only way to truly defeat them is to blast them with just a massive amount of just bright energy, basically white light. And the way in which you can pull that off is by combining rings together or something along those lines. By blasting them with a massive amount of light energy, what it does is it creates a feedback in the ring, basically causes the ring to essentially overload. And the result is that this feedback resonates throughout the Black Lanterns themselves, and people just explode. But what this does, with the arrival of these kids, with the arrival of the Indigo tribe showing up and basically helping the Green Lanterns to stave off the Black Lantern Corps, we switch our focus to the Red Lanterns. Now again, we talked about this in the last video in the sense that the Red Lanterns were basically dealing with the aftermath of the Green Lanterns trying to retrieve one of their own who had previously perished. And in the middle of this whole conflict, with the Green Lanterns being the only ones who had left there, the Black Lantern rings started descending on everyone. And what happens is 4 of the 5 inversions are basically resurrected. Now, the 5th inversion is Atrocitus himself, the person who created the Red Lantern Corps. But to provide a little bit of history, for those of you guys who are watching this video for the first time, the first thing I would suggest is checking out the origin of the Red Lanterns. That way you'll fully understand who the 5 inversions are. But the long and short of this is that before the Green Lanterns were ever created by the Guardians of the Universe had created the Manhunters. And the Manhunters are basically just robots. And the belief of the Guardians is that no credible threat with regards to people trying to obliterate planets or anything along those lines. The problem is that the Manhunters malfunctioned. We'll actually find out later on down the line that it was one of the Guardians themselves that caused it to happen. But the idea is that with the Manhunters basically going awry, they traveled to Sector 666 and basically killed everything. And so what ended up happening is the survivors of Sector 666, these 5 inversions, came together in their hatred for the Guardians of the Universe and began the process of plotting and trying to find a way to eliminate the Guardians in their entirety, along with the newly formed Green Lantern Corps. And so where Atrocitus was one of the 5 inversions, and it basically seen a vision of the future with regards to what's actually happening right now, what he in turn did is killed the other 4 inversions and then created the Red Lantern Corps. And so that's why these inversions are resurrected, because these are the people that Atrocitus killed. And so in this instance, with the 4 inversions popping up as Black Lanterns, Atrocitus is fearless and doesn't care. Because he's so full of rage, because rage is the one governing force of his life, his heart was already charged with full emotion. But the caveat to this, and remember, when it comes to the Red Lanterns, when they're given the Red Lantern ring, it replaces their heart. And so when the Black Lanterns attack Atrocitus for the purpose of taking his heart and consuming it, his heart will inevitably regrow. Now this has both a benefit and a drawback. The benefit is that they can't kill Atrocitus by tearing his heart out, which means the Red Lanterns cannot be killed by the Black Lanterns, and the Red Lanterns themselves cannot become Black Lanterns, unless of course the ring is taken away. The drawback to this is they are basically an infinite source of emotion. As long as they keep like Red Lanterns prisoners, Black Lanterns could literally just repeatedly tear out their hearts and consume them until they charge the central power of Adam. That's why this threat of the Black Lanterns has to be dealt with as fast as humanly possible. But in this instance, because Atrocitus is basically the living embodiment of rage, the Black Lanterns don't stand a chance. You know, him blasting with massive amounts of energy and so on and so forth, again, causes these Black Lanterns to come crashing down. And so what this does is basically transition to this third part of the story, this last little bit, where we basically pick up with Hal Jordan, the Green Lantern, we pick up with Sinestro, and we pick up with the Indigo Tribe, as well as the Star Sapphire. This comes out of the idea that with Sinestro having been imprisoned by the Green Lanterns after the event of the Sinestro Corps War, it allowed a villain by the name of Mongo, one of the most notable enemies in DC, and someone who's basically equal to Superman in strength in a lot of ways, to rise to power after receiving a Yellow Lantern ring, and then basically take over the Sinestro Corps himself. And so what this
Whoa. Alright. Should I tell him, Jason? It's pretty incredible.
Because the Star Sapphires had taken a number of the Sinestro Corps and tried to convert them into Star Sapphires. And so because of that,
We're gonna have a week of Lethal Protector paintings coming up, gentlemen, and potential leads and audience. Ladies. Just kidding. I mean, I'm not stupid. I know there's no ladies in the audience.
puts us where we are right now with regards to a little bit of infighting in the sense that we have Hal Jordan and Sinestro bickering among one another, but it's basically this idea that we have to begin working together. We have to function as a cohesive unit, because if we don't, this war of life will consume us all, and the Black Lanterns will just bring about the end of all things in the universe. So ultimately what this does is, again, let's fix up a little bit with regards to the Blue Lanterns and the Orange Lanterns. Remember, the Orange Lanterns are basically the Lantern Corps of greed, of avarice, but instead of having an actual core, it's basically just large things themselves, and since this core consists of constructs. But the Blue Lanterns are basically a Lantern Corps based on hope. It's the idea that no matter how bad things get, there's always a way to overcome things. And so the power of the Blue Lantern only really stands some measure when it's accompanied by the powers of the Green Lantern. The Green Lantern is kind of the foundation that powers the Blue Lantern Corps. And that's why in this instance, despite the fact that the Blue Lanterns are largely the most powerful, they're really struggling against the Green Lanterns because there's no Green Lanterns there to bolster their own power. But this changes when Indigo 1 brings Hal Jordan and Sinestro and Star Sapphire directly to where it is the Green Lanterns are at. Because again, the Green Lanterns bolster the Blue Lantern power, and the Blue Lantern rings can supercharge the Green Lantern rings. They're designed to basically work together. But this allows the Green Lantern to need facing against Larfleeze. The problem is that in the middle of all this, all the orange constructs vanish. And the reason for this is because Larfleeze recalled them all to himself because of the fact that, again, the Black Lantern rings descended on Larfleeze's base of operations and began bonding himself to all these people Larfleeze had killed in his greed and in his hubris. And so with this in mind, Larfleeze basically begins to panic and basically begins to run off, but is met by the arrival of Atrocitus, who basically shows up having defeated all the inversions and the Black Lanterns on his own home planet with the intention of not only seizing the Orange Lantern ring for himself, but solution is to still take out all the different lantern cores to basically ensure that the Guardians of the Universe are defeated and so on and so forth. He's not yet been recruited to the cause of all the other lanterns. He's not yet been told, here's everything that's going on. He's aware of the prophecy of Blackest Night. He's aware of what it means, but he doesn't really seem to grasp the idea that if the prophecy of Blackest Night rises to its full fruition, everybody will die, including him and the Red Lantern himself. Okay, so jumping back into Blackest Night again, this is when everything begins to change, and this is cool, because for those of you guys who are following or who saw our very first Blackest Night video, which was basically the main Blackest Night story, issues 1 through 4, this finally brings us to the point whereby the central power battery is completely charged.
Exciting things coming down the pipeline, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies.
It's not like this right off the bat. It's this continued fight against all these different members of the Black Lantern Corps. Now remember, when it comes to the Indigo Tribe, because they're the logical and reasonable ones, they're the ones who immediately picked up the clues right off the bat on how to defeat the Black Lanterns. It's basically just a massive amount of light. Now the way in which this comes about is with one of the members of the Indigo Tribe, second in command, speaking with one of the other Green Lanterns. And while they're facing off against all these, these Black Lanterns, the question's asked, how is it that we're able to kill them the way we are? And the response of the member of the Indigo Tribe is to simply say, I can combine my light with your light, and we can in turn destroy the Black Lantern rings. The issue with this is that it has to be concentrated. It cannot be a wide burst. It cannot be a scatter shot. And that's what's established here, because the question asked by the Green Lantern in hand is, well, why don't we just fly up into the air and just broadcast our light everywhere? And the reason why is because they're only dealing with so much light. They only have so much to go around. And so the response is, if they were to fly up into the atmosphere and if they were to use this, what they would basically do is blanket the Black Lanterns in light, but it wouldn't be concentrated enough to actually destroy the rings. But all that amounts to a zero sum anyway, because in the middle of this conflict, the Black Lanterns stop, and then they all take off with the command to devour Will, due to the fact that the central power battery for the Black Lanterns is fully charged at 100%. Now what this does is it gives us the other half of the equation. For the first part of this, which we talked about in the last video, was basically consuming emotionally charged parts after forcing individuals to feel all these different emotions when their loved ones came back as Black Lanterns. The other half is to eliminate anybody who can basically be a threat. Because remember, if the Black Lanterns were to fight these Green Lanterns and try to kill them, there's always going to be more Green Lanterns. Remember, that's the basis of the Green Lantern Corps, that whenever a Green Lantern dies, its ring immediately goes out and seeks a new host. But to beat them to the punch, what they do is try to strip the Green Lanterns of their source of energy. They go directly after the central power battery, remove its connection to the emotional spectrum, and in turn, no matter how many Green Lantern rings there are out there, they'll simply just cease function. And the other half of this scenario is the Green Lanterns facing off with it the absolute best they can, stemming this flow of Black Lantern. Because essentially, every Black Lantern in the vicinity on the planet of Oa, and even some from other parts of the cosmos, are all traveling directly to destroy the central power battery. But, I mean, look at this. Look at the sheer number of Black Lanterns here. That's not all of them. And so hopefully that gives you some indication as to how many Black Lanterns are floating out there in the cosmos, how many Black Lanterns are fighting however many other beings exist out there. And so in this instance, where they basically try to pull the central power battery, the efforts of the Green Lanterns are virtually non-existent. There's really nothing they can do. At the same time, the Red Lanterns show up. The Red Lanterns showing up is to help the Green Lanterns defeat the Black Lanterns. But again, because of the fact that the Black Lantern rings need concentrated beams of light in order to basically be destroyed, in the end, the hatred from the Red Lantern means they're just mindless beasts attacking things. And so that's all they know. All they know is to go to the Black Lanterns and attack the Black Lantern. Well, for all the good it does, they might as well be, beating a metal wall with a wooden baseball bat. It's not going to do them any good. And with all these Black Lanterns coming together and pulling out the central power battery, Kyle Rayner is the one who saves the day. Because what Kyle Rayner does is travel and basically grab the source of the Alpha Lantern power, kind of like this center core of the central power battery, basically yank it out, take it to where the Black Lanterns are at, and detonate. He effectively needs to kill himself in the explosion, but it does let off this massive amount of Green Lantern energy. And when that happens, it does begin the process of taking
Been given the green light to talk about how Jason Browersma, who got the he's the gentleman who got the toxin lethal protector. He is gonna send me 5 more lethal protectors, and we're gonna do a set of 6. I'm thinking it's gonna be like dang, I can't remember who he said. Oh, probably like Noel and Codex and, and Sleeper, characters like that. So that's gonna be awesome, and I'm happy that they're all going to one person. That's super cool. I'm really happy about that. Because it's okay if they get split up. I just want them to all be with people who care about them. So if they're all with one person, I know that they have a higher trust that they'll be taken care of. Thousands of rings that are going to start making their way to where Kyle Rayner is. And that's the craziness of the situation, is because it's the actions of Guy Gardner as a Red and Green Lantern destroying the Black Lantern Corps that are making things even more dangerous for Kyle Rayner. And so this is when you start to get the other half of the equation of all these different tribes beginning to come together, in the sense that the Star Sapphires being so imbued with love, of helping others feel love, that the ring goes off whenever somebody is feeling heartbroken. And in this instance, one of the Star Sapphires, her ring goes off when Sonic Natsu basically begins to lose hope in the idea that she'll be able to resurrect Kyle Rayner, that she's heartbroken because she may lose the man she loves. And in that moment, this Star Sapphire comes flying to the rescue. Through their ability to manipulate the emotional spectrum aspect of love, they can help bring people back. They are as much healers as they are individuals who spread love. Now again, they're very parasitic in terms of how their lantern corps works. But that's why they're not these saints, is because they're just as inclined to encase you in crystal and convert you to a Star Sapphire as they are to actually help you out. Bringing Kyle Rayner back by passing the love of Sonic Natsu to Kyle Rayner himself serves the purpose of allowing the story to continue on. And what ends up happening here is Kyle Rayner gets his ring back and goes forward as a Green Lantern, helping to cast off the rest of these Black Lanterns, along with the question being asked, how are they going to get the ring off of Guy Gardner? With Guy Gardner being probably one of the most important Green Lanterns because of how amazing he is, the goal is to find a Blue Lantern that can remove the ring from it. Now, moving into the last little tidbit of our tie-ins before we actually jump back into the main Green Lantern story itself, we pick up with what's probably the coolest tie-ins, which is everybody versus the Red Lanterns. It's the Orange Lanterns, the Blue Lanterns, and the Star Sapphires, and the Indigo Tribe, and the Green Lanterns against Atrocitus. It's really cool. What this does is it picks up in the aftermath of Atrocitus chasing after the Orange Lantern Larfleet. And so the whole idea is that he actually seizes the Orange Lantern battery from Larfleet himself, and then in turn just becomes obsessed with greed. And it's interesting because we don't really get, usually get to see things like that. But in the middle of this whole thing, he's met with Sinestro and St. Walker of the Blue Lanterns, and Jordan of the Green Lanterns, and Carol Ferris of the Star Sapphires, and Indigo One. And where there's a little bit of bickering and a little bit of arguing between all these different things, once it all settles down, we actually end up learning a few things that took place. Now, a lot of this is a misunderstanding. We're looking at something in a compartmentalized fashion as opposed to the overarching thing, in the sense that Sinestro starts making the case, well, you, Hal Jordan, were the one who went to the planet, went to the Vega system where Larfleet resided, which violated the treaty between the Guardians and Larfleet, but you did it at the request of the Guardians, and you showed up on Ismail, the home of the Red Lanterns, because you were trying to rescue me, because the Guardians wanted you to. You were doing all these things the Guardians wanted you to do, and you were the one who set the War of Light in motion, which is kind of true to a degree, but not necessarily. The War of Light was not set off by any one thing. It was a litany of different things all happening at the same time that all actually culminated with Sinestro himself, in the sense that Sinestro had basically waged war against the Green Lanterns. In the Sinestro Corps War, the Guardians allowed the Green Lanterns to start killing people. And in this instance, it basically started off as these small little pot shots here and there. Lyra, a Green Lantern who killed a member of the Sinestro Corps when she wasn't supposed to. It was Mongol taking over the Sinestro Corps in the absence of Sinestro himself, and then using the Corps to basically implement his own campaigns, which led to the Green Lanterns and the Sinestro Corps fighting each other again. It was Larfleet basically believing that the treaty between himself and the Guardians had been violated when the Green Lanterns, led by Hal Jordan, showed up there. The Blue Lantern Corps being created by Gambit and Stave. It was the rise of the Black Lanterns. It was all these things that came together and culminated in the War of Light. So in truth, if it's anybody's fault, it's everyone's fault, because everybody had a hand in it somehow. But the coolest thing about this is that it really asks the question, if we had to define an actual person who was responsible, which person would that be? And the argument presented here in the story is that it's actually Atrocitus, because Atrocitus was the one who originally saw the problem prophecy of Blackest Night and realized what was going to happen with the War of Light, who taunted Adam Seward, the Green Lantern, who gave Hal Jordan his ring, and it was Adam Seward who basically told everybody about the prophecy of Blackest Night and the War of Light. So maybe that's the case. But again, that's the nature of how this thing plays out. And it's the nature of what Jeff Johns is kind of pointing out here, that in any one particular scenario, barring the person going in and then just committing a series of linear acts, it's never any one particular person's fault when it comes to this. There's equal blame all around. Everybody screwed up equally. That's basically the scenario here. Again, the cool thing about this is that people try to talk reason to what's going on with this process. The fact that he's so driven by rage and he's so angry. But notice this, there is somewhat of a measure of respect among these various members of the Lantern Corps and the Guardians of the Universe, Gambit and Sage, because they realize the stakes are much higher than their own individual petty squabbles. I mean, looking at someone like Val Sinestro, in his mind, it's his way or the highway. There's the way he wants things to be, and there's everybody else who's wrong. But in this scenario, he's bargaining. He's telling, look, like, hey, Atrocitus, I will work with you if you ally us, and we'll destroy the Green Lantern Corps. Remember, they have a mutual hatred for the Green Lanterns. It's largely saying, yeah, sure, I mean, I'll join too, but, like, I want my own Guardian. Like, I want a Guardian of the Universe for myself. That's just largely being greedy, because that's his whole thing. He's just a super greedy guy. But these people who would never work together are effectively finding common ground, if for no other reason than self-preservation. The Black Lanterns have united the Lantern Corps together in their desire to not die. It's a selfish motivation, but selfish is not inherently an evil thing. In this particular story, it's cool because it's people coming together for a singular cause. It's people coming together and basically working together. And that's the beauty of the Indigo Tribe. Because remember, the Indigo Tribe is the voice of reason, is the voice of logic, for the ones that do not allow themselves to get caught up in petty squabbles. And so what happens is Indigo One actually takes all the members here from these Lantern Corps and teleports them to Islam, to the home of Atrocitus. And this is important because Atrocitus actually begins to feel some measure of compassion is him sitting down and finding common ground with the other Lantern Corps. Because in the mind of Atrocitus, he's not necessarily a villain. By and large, when it comes to comic books, we usually define villains in a subjective way, which means we don't all define villains the exact same way. But for the most part, I define villains as people who do bad things because they can. Not because there's any real motivation to it, but because they're just like, I can commit this crime, so I'm going to commit this crime. Like, I just want a lot of money. That's how I would define a villain. Atrocitus, as a Red Lantern, looks to destroy the Green Lanterns and the Guardians of the Universe. But notice this, it's not because he can't. He doesn't say, like, I want to eliminate the Guardians of the Universe and the Green Lanterns because I just don't like the fact that the Guardians are blue and small, and I just don't like the Green Lanterns because I hate the color green. It's nothing like that. It's basically him saying, my people were wiped out because the Guardians of the Universe were foolish and they were arrogant, and they believed they could police the universe with robots, and those robots destroyed everything I knew and loved. And I will go to the end of the earth. I will go to the end of time. I will do whatever I have to eliminate the Guardians of the Universe. Not because I hate them, but because I want to make sure they cannot keep making stupid decisions that will result in the loss of life of the innocent people. And so while his motivations are extreme, he's not really a villain. He's not really a bad guy in the traditional sense. And that's what's so cool about this, is it takes the character as we perceive him and dumps him on his head. It literally just flips the script on the whole thing. And so in the end, in this recognition, Atrocitus basically allies himself with this Lantern Corps. He says, fine, I don't want innocent life to be wiped out by the Black Lanterns. I believe innocent life should continue to thrive. If the Black Lanterns are the immediate threat to innocent people, then I will do my best to keep them alive. I will do my best to save those innocent lives. But as soon as this is done, as soon as this is over, and as soon as this threat is quelled, you can bet all the money in your pockets that I'm coming for. I'm coming for you as a Guardians of the Universe, and I'm coming for you as a Green Lantern. And woe betide you if anything doesn't get in my way.
Yeah, Martin, just listen to your message. That sounds great, man. Did you say you want to get a set of lethal protectors, or was it 1 through 6? What is 1 through 6? Is that a different... Oh, lethal protector 1 through 6. Oh, okay, I see what you're saying. Great. I hate working on those glossy, not glossy, the foil backgrounds anyway. But, yeah, I love the idea of doing all these different sets. That's really fun. I've got some ideas for some sets of my own that I'm going to do. Like have them auctioned or something.
During the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, when he broke down on a molecular level, he was supposed to go to the afterlife. He was supposed to be dead. Netcon got in their way and stopped them from dying and sent them back. And that's how they lived. Now, the other half of this is, remember, the only real spacefaring force that's capable of dealing with these Black Lanterns is the Green Lantern Corps. And like we basically just thrown at these Black Lantern rings. So you'd have to have somebody like Dr. Light who could manipulate light. You'd have to have like multiple forces coming together and firing all their rings at the same time and channeling those energies in order to destroy them. And the whole idea of channeling their energies comes to bear for the various leaders of the Lantern Corps to basically put their energies together into the Black Lantern Central Power Battery. Remember, the Black Lantern Central Power Battery, like all the other Central Power Batteries, is basically where the Black Lanterns get their power from. And so the whole idea is if they destroy the Central Power Battery, it'll do two things. The first is it'll basically deactivate all the Black Lantern rings, and the second is it'll send Necron back to his own realm, to wherever it was that he came from. The problem is it doesn't work. Because it's so much power and so much energy, it's almost impossible to do. And so what ends up happening here is probably one of the greatest moments in the history of comics. These rings start flying out. One of them says, Bruce Wayne of Earth, rise. So Bruce Wayne, Bruce Wayne's dead, and ends up coming back. And it's one of the coolest things. Now remember, this is not really Bruce Wayne. It's not really the essence of Bruce Wayne, the spirit of Bruce Wayne. It's his body. It's basically the Black Lantern rings reconstituting Bruce Wayne's body and then using it as a vector. But when it comes to Bruce Wayne, he is probably one of the single most important characters in all of the DC landscape for a bunch of different reasons. One of the first reasons is because of the fact that everyone is tethered to him. And that's why he was brought back. But the whole idea is that whether they trust him, whether they don't trust him, whether they love him, whether they hate him, everybody in some form or fashion is connected emotionally to Bruce Wayne. And so because of this, using this emotional tether of Bruce Wayne, in the shock of the moment, all of these guys are basically bonded with Black Lantern rings. And we end up with the Black Lantern Justice League. The only exception to this is Hal Jordan and Barry Allen. At this point, we switch over to John Stewart. Now, John Stewart is one of those Green Lanterns where he basically achieved the height of his popularity during the Justice League cartoon show. He predates that show by like 30 years, but he was just one of those Green Lanterns out there. And in the end, despite the fact that he was introduced back then, despite the fact that he was amazing, it didn't much matter because the Green Lantern titles weren't selling anyway. But with the Justice League cartoon show, he was the only Green Lantern on that show. And so it was a way to just bolster him up. Say, hey, you want a Green Lantern? You get John Stewart and nobody else. But in this instance, one of the things to remember, one of the things we talked about before, was John Stewart in his younger days. John Stewart was a member of the Marines, and then eventually he became a Green Lantern. But when he first became a Green Lantern, he was headstrong, he was arrogant. This came to bear with a planet called Xanthi. This was basically a planet that was part of this really weird storyline. But the idea is that there was a bomb in the middle of the planet, and instead of basically keeping it safe, instead of keeping the bomb from detonating, John Stewart flew in and tried to basically defuse it. The result was that the bomb went off, killed the planet, and killed everybody on it. This is weighed on John Stewart's mind ever since. And that's the cool thing about this. There's always been a background of his character. And so him being here, he's the only one on this Black Lantern version of Xanthi, this planet that was reconstituted by the Black Lantern rings alongside everybody who was killed. But the cool thing about this is John Stewart is not a guy to be trifled with. John Stewart is an absolute beast. He literally just starts creating machine gun constructs, and he unleashes holy hell on every single one of these Black Lanterns. It is pretty amazing. But ultimately, John Stewart also recognizes that if he were to continue fighting this battle on his own, he would assuredly die. And if he's taken down by one of the Black Lanterns, it'll just add to their existing ranks. Now, jumping back to Earth, because I know you guys are really interested in Earth, the Black Lantern Justice League versus all these different superheroes, or at least whatever's left, is actually pretty impressive, because they're all basically fighting their own personal demons. It's no accident that each of these members is being pitted against somebody who they are most familiar with. For example, when Hal Jordan became paralyzed during the old Emerald Twilight stories, him facing off against Superman and defeating him has always been considered an insult to Superman himself and the rest of the superhero community. A lot of this was because of the fact that Hal Jordan's parallax was trying to obliterate the entirety of the universe, but it was still pretty cool. But Barry Allen grabbing Hal Jordan and racing a couple seconds into the future basically allows, or at least it means, these Black Lantern rings that are chasing them are basically gone. Because while they are a couple seconds ahead, at the end of the day, in the present moment, right then and there, they're gone. While all this is happening, John Stewart is racing the Earth with an army of all these Black Lanterns behind him. So all these things are basically crescendoing down into this moment when everybody basically coalesces on Earth. Everybody shows up on Earth, and it's this massive final battle. The other half of this is that while these leaders of the various Lantern Corps are able to face off against some of these threats, at the end of the day, the number of Black Lanterns there are almost overwhelming. There's millions of them. And so in response to this, Ganthet, one of the Guardians of the Universe, one of the guys who helped to create the Green Lantern Corps, comes along and basically says, I'm making myself a Green Lantern. Not only that, because of the fact that almost all the rings are basically built on the very nature of the Lantern rings themselves, the Green Lantern rings, in the sense of how they're designed, how they're programmed, what this means is that
This one's gonna look
and then
fucking
go
sweet.
out and find a host. What this does is it allows for temporary bolstering of numbers. We end up seeing these rings race off and pick some amazing hosts. The first one that gets picked is Lex Luthor. And it's the coolest thing ever because while this is going on, Lex Luthor met with an orange ring of athletes. He becomes an orange lantern. Scarecrow becomes a yellow lantern. Barry Allen, a blue lantern, so on and so forth. It's one of the coolest things ever. We get to see characters as various members of the Lantern Corps that we would normally never see in this particular scenario. And that's why it's so interesting, is because Blackest Night was designed to be this massive story that was huge in scope. But one of the first things that people started asking when we saw these introductions of these different Lantern Corps is, well, what would happen if Superman became like a Red Lantern? Or what would happen if like Wonder Woman became like a Star Sapphire? That's the way this plays out, is because it's basically giving fans their heart's desire. Here's what you want to see. Characters who would never have a lantern ring suddenly get one, and then what would they be like? Now, of course, in the middle of all this, we transition basically out to what's left of the Green Lantern Corps, to Kyle Rayner, to Saraya Natu, the daughter of Sinestro, all these different things. Now, remember, in the last video, we talked about how Kyle Rayner had basically died, how Kyle Rayner as the Green Lantern was believed to have been dead. It took the combined efforts of one of the Star Sapphires, the Lantern Tide of Love, to grab Saraya Natu, the daughter of Sinestro, who Kyle Rayner, I guess, who was in love with Kyle Rayner, to basically tether that life force and bring back Kyle Rayner, who effectively sort of resurrected. The problem with this is that in that moment when Kyle Rayner was dead, Guy Gardner of Earth lost it. Now, here's the funny thing. Man, I love Guy Gardner. Guy Gardner fans are relatively small. I mean, it's not the biggest fan base out there, but by God, they are hardcore. They they love Guy Gardner. And understandably so, because Guy Gardner is like the guy you want in your corner. When the world's going to pot, when it's all going down, if I'm somebody and I'm like, okay, who am I going to pick to be my Green Lantern and who do I want in my corner? Guy Gardner. Because he will fight until he dies. Like, he is so awesome and he's so badass. And the guy's a former cop, basically become a Green Lantern. So, like, he's a no-nonsense guy. In the scenario, when he lost his mind, he was suddenly bonded with the Red Lantern ring. Now, remember, when it comes to the Red Lanterns, you don't get to choose to become one. When you get so full of rage and so full of wrath, the Red Lantern ring just shows up to you and says, you have great rage in your heart, you belong to the Red Lantern Corps, and just forces itself onto you. But this is important, because when a person becomes a Red Lantern, their heart basically gets replaced by the Red Lantern ring, which means to say the Red Lantern ring becomes their heart. Their blood gets replaced with plasma. If Kyle Rayner or somebody were to walk up and just pick the Red Lantern ring off of Guy Gardner, it would kill him. His heart would basically cease to exist. His body would shut down, and that would be the end of it. And so this is basically a conflict on two fronts. Is Kyle Rayner and Saraya Natu and the Green Lantern Corps trying to face off against the Black Lanterns, while at the same time trying to find a way to bring Guy Gardner back? Now, none of it really matters anyway, because Guy Gardner as a Red Lantern is wrecking the Black Lanterns. Dude, it is one of the coolest things to see, because, dude, the guy loses. Man, look at this upcoming action right here. The guy loses his mind on these Black Lanterns. Like, they're doing what they can, but it doesn't matter, man. Guy Gardner freaks out and says, come feel me. It's one of the coolest things ever to see his character freak out like this, because he's just a force of nature. Like, he's just wrecking through every last one of these Black Lanterns. Not enough that he's destroying them in their entirety and reducing the number by a huge portion, but certainly enough that the Black Lanterns are starting to get a little concerned. Now, in the middle of all this, we're met with the arrival of Mogo, basically this planet that received the Green Lantern ring. Now, Mogo is one of the most powerful Green Lanterns out there, just because of the fact that he's able to put out a massive amount of power because of his size. But Mogo is also like this secondary base of operations. Because he's a planet, should Oa, the home base of the Green Lanterns and the Guardians of the Universe, should it ever be destroyed, Mogo would become their base of operations. We saw that in the New 52. But what Mogo also says is that in this moment right now, there is a protocol that was devised by the Guardians of the Universe that was given to Mogo. Should Oa ever become overrun, the idea of Mogo is to implement what's called a purge, to effectively purge those who are intruding. In this instance, it's the Black Lanterns. And so what Mogo does is basically increase his own gravitational pull and then grab every single thing within the immediate vicinity on Oa and drag it directly to where he's at. And it brings him all down to the surface of his own planet. What he does is he basically grabs these Black Lanterns and starts pulling them down into his own core, which is superheated like the core of any planet, and then basically just starts atomizing them. So sure, I guess their rings are there, but their physical bodies are destroyed. The rings are useless without a physical body. And so where the day is won, so to speak, for a temporary moment, what we end up still having is Guy Gardner as a Red Lantern. And so the question becomes, how do you fix this? How do you fix a guy who's a Red Lantern? The only way to really fix a Red Lantern, quote unquote, is to basically have a Blue Lantern show up and cleanse their body of the red impurity, and then Okay, so we're wrapping up Blackest Night. We have like this one and another video today, and then we're done. And we're gonna be finished with our double uploads on Blackest Night. As much as I love it, I kind of want to return to just doing like Green Lantern videos once a week because I think it gets a little weird, oversaturated with Green Lantern. Green Lantern videos drive everybody crazy. But anyway, so one thing that's super new, the long and short of this is that Blackest Night is basically the end times. It's this idea that these Black Lantern rings have just kind of risen out of nowhere. And the result is that they're bonding themselves to people who are both living and dead. Now, with those who are living, it's basically those who died, and then they were supposed to move on to the afterlife, but they did. DC Editorial decided to bring them back, but within the confines of DC's story itself, which is to say within the DC universe, it was this idea that the entity of death, Necron, had stepped in and kept those characters from dying. Now, there are two conflicts taking place. The first one is out in space involving the Green Lantern Corps, and the second is on Earth. And on Earth, it's largely just the superheroes that are there doing the best they can to stave off against this conflict. It's members of the Sinestro Corps, Green Lantern Corps, and so on and so forth. It's all the corps on Earth trying to stop the end of all things. Because remember, if the Black Lanterns basically bond rings to everybody, then the emotional spectrum will effectively cease to exist. All beings everywhere will feel no emotion whatsoever. And the result is that they will just sort of usher in this new era of darkness. The universe itself will effectively die. Now, what we come up to this point was the idea that the superheroes were just trying to stave off this eventuality. They were trying to stave off the idea that everything was going to die. But in the middle of their attempts to stop the being Necron, they're suddenly met by the arrival of the Spectre. Now, the Spectre is a character that we haven't really talked about too often. We haven't really done a whole lot with him. When it came to the Spectre as a concept, he goes all the way back to like 1940. I mean, he's one of DC's oldest characters. He was created by Jerry Siegel, I think it was. And the whole idea was that the Spectre was designed to be really one of the earliest components of DC's whole mythological side, which is to say all their demons and angels and so on and so forth. But the Spectre is the living embodiment of basically God's vengeance in the sense that there was a guy named Jim Corrigan. He was shot in the line of duty. Instead of dying, he basically became a host for the Spectre. And so the Spectre basically just travels around the earth.
Like a good Ghost Rider with Superman-like abilities.
By God, it's basically being condemned to damnation, and then just wisps them away. And that's really about it. But the whole idea with the Spectre is that in the early days, he was crazy powerful. I mean, he was
I know it's fucked up to change my signature, but I think I found a better signature because Clayton said my signature should look like his, and I was like, that's a good point. Mine doesn't look like yours. But I think I developed one that looks pretty good. That homages his signature. Literally, my whole career is just an homage to Clayton, which I am more than happy to have that happen.
Here in a minute, but the idea was that, you know, Hal Jordan basically became this corruptible guy, and DC was kind of green. And so it made sense to basically merge Hal Jordan and the Spectre together, which is how that happened. But the whole idea was that this continuity took place with the Spectre concept. Now, in terms of how it exists now, Hal Jordan and the Spectre split from one another, it presented itself as the same scenario. What do they do with the Spectre if he doesn't have a host? And so what this did is it introduced a character by the name of Crispin Allen. And the whole idea was that Crispin Allen was basically this guy who was a partner of the character of Renee Montoya. Crispin Allen is basically the new host for the Spectre. And it's one of those interesting scenarios. And what this does is it actually leads us into the concept of parallax. Because the Spectre is designed to be the living embodiment of God's vengeance, because the Spectre, while he is weaker than he's historically been, is still an incredibly powerful being. What this means is that none of the heroes on Earth can actually stop this Spectre. Now, in terms of the fact that Crispin Allen was killed and then became a host for the Spectre, this meant that Crispin Allen could actually become a Black Lantern. And that's what we saw over the course of the Blackest Night story, is we basically saw a ring bond itself to Crispin Allen. And so what we learned over the course of Blackest Night is that instead of the Black Lantern rings actually resurrecting the dead, instead what they were doing is they were bonding themselves to the corpses of those who died and then basically duplicating them. And so in this instance, this Black Lantern Spectre is not actually the Spectre. Instead, it's the ring creating an image of the Spectre. And the way that we know that is because of the fact that with Hal Jordan basically sitting down and saying, we cannot defeat the Spectre on our own because of the sheer power that he has, he says the only way to do this is to bring back an entity that I've never wanted to bring back again. What he does is he brings back Parallax. But at this moment right now, when Hal Jordan basically goes back to being Parallax, when he returns to being a host of a Parallax entity, he's not as powerful as he was. But the goal of him returning to the role of Parallax is not the specter, it's for the purpose of bringing the specter out. When Hal Jordan is parallaxed, begins fighting the specter and essentially tears him open, what we end up finding is that within this Black Lantern shell is the actual specter himself alongside Christmas Alley. And so they're basically being held captive and their power is being channeled and used by the Black Lantern. Now following this defeat of Black Lantern Spectre, what ends up happening is it's basically just Hal Jordan being split in half again. Because Hal Jordan is still in there, he has an emotional tie to Carol Ferris. Carol Ferris was the love interest of Hal Jordan for years and years and years and years. And so because of this, it's basically this idea that the Spectre can seize hold of Parallax and pull the entity out of Hal Jordan, but only if somebody is pulling the other direction. And that's why that works, is because it's basically Carol Ferris grabs onto the Hal Jordan concept and pulls on him while the Parallax entity is being pulled out, and it means that Hal Jordan goes back to his normal self. The other half of this is actually the actions of Atrocitus of the Red Lantern. But one of the things that Jeff John hits on here is the idea of the Red Lantern entity. And so what this is going to do is lead into all these different entities. Now we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But for right now, what this also gets at is the idea that no one can really escape the might of a lantern ring so long as a being is sensitive. If a ring can bond to them, they can become part of that core. And in this instance, what Atrocitus actually tries to do is bond the Spectre to the Red Lantern, but it doesn't last. It lasts maybe for like a handle or two. And the reason for this is because when a Red Lantern ring takes over a host, a certain amount of time has to pass before that person is completely converted into a Red Lantern. But in this instance, because the Spectre is so powerful, he doesn't fall prey. His heart's not replaced or anything like those things. But the reason why Atrocitus did this is because Atrocitus has actually believed that the Spectre is basically the Red Lantern entity that Atrocitus has been looking for, the Red Lantern equivalent to like Parallax. And so because of this, the Spectre will respond by saying, you can't make me into a Red Lantern, but I've met the entity that you're looking for, and if you find it, it will kill you. It's this idea that Jeff Johns is setting the stage for this huge, expansive revelation of all these different things that will come later on down the line with regards to all these different cores. Now, with regards to the Spectre itself, what he ends up doing is actually try to take out Necron. But this is a major limitation of the Spectre. While the Spectre used to be this godly, powerful being back in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, nowadays, he's basically just a guy that shows up and just whisks the souls of the damned off, and that's it. That's really all there is to it. In this instance, Necron does not have a soul. And so in this instance, because of the fact that Necron does not actually have a soul for the Spectre to take, the Spectre is basically powerless against it. Not only this, Necron actually whisks the Spectre away. What it means is the right hand of God cannot stop Necron. Now, if the Titans chose to step in, sure, like that would be the end, and Necron would be defeated. But, you know, in this circumstance, the story needs to be told. So aside from pulling in, you know, one of those caveats, that's really about it. Things wrap up pretty fast. Now, with regards to the whole idea of Guy Gardner and the Green Lantern Corps, one of the things that we had talked about in the last video was that the Green Lantern
Skylar Homers.
the fact that so many of them were being killed by Black Lanterns and then being converted into Black Lanterns themselves. Kyle Rayner, one of the more popular Green Lanterns, was believed to have been killed. And in his rage, Guy Gardner had lost his mind and then was bonded with the Red Lantern ring. What we're seeing right now is this transitionary period where Guy Gardner is basically at a point where if the ring is pulled off, he will essentially die. The various Green Lanterns are basically trying to find a way to bring Guy Gardner down and then basically cure him. Because remember, when a person becomes a Red Lantern, they're just mindless rage. And so the Green Lantern planet Mogo is actually able to offer some measure of a reprieve. And it's really cool the way this happens. What Mogo basically does is force Guy Gardner to basically have this inner fight with himself. Which is to say, the Green Lantern part of himself that recalls all the great memories and the love interests he's had and different things like that. And the Red Lantern part of himself that really just kind of feeds on all the horrible experiences that he's had. The idea here is to actually offer some measure of a distraction to allow the Green Lanterns to muster their number and then subdue Guy Gardner. And so what this does is it allows Mogo the planet to actually pull Guy Gardner down inside of him and then begin releasing all these different leeches. Now, this is the second way in which a person can be cured when it comes to Red Lantern rage. In truth, while this does purge a lot of the Red Lantern energy out of him, one of the things that's immediately made clear is that Guy Gardner is not completely cured of the Red Lantern energy. If his ring was removed, he would die. And so the only way to really bring him back, the only way to restore some measure of normalcy is to bring him to a Blue Lantern. Because Blue Lanterns are the ones that basically go through this sort of cleansing process, and they're the only way in which a person who is a Red Lantern can safely have their ring removed and then go back to being part of Red Lantern.
Yeah, no worries, Jason. You can message me anytime. I am going to take a little break here in just a moment. Let's see if I can do some of his face first.
At the end of the day, they're not able to defeat a being of such intense power. The arrival of Guy Gardner and the other Green Lanterns, the fact that the Blue Lanterns are here, all the different corps have united under the idea of trying to defeat Necron, but none of them can do it because he's just such an astronomically powerful being. Not only that, we end up getting an explanation as to why it was that Necron stepped in the way and kept all these different superheroes from dying over the course of their lives. The reason for this is because Necron has been seeking something out, and the only way he can attain it is to actually kill one of the Guardians of the Universe and then use their blood in a ritual of sorts, and then in turn wake up something called the Life Entity. And so when it comes to the Life Entity itself, it's essentially this idea that this is kind of a representation of where life originated, and that's one of the big revelations that come out of this, because it was believed that the Guardians of the Universe, the Malthusians, were the first race in the universe. But what this reveals to us is life did not start with the Malthusians, it started on Earth. The Malthusians covered that up. They basically took the Life Entity, buried it in the core of the Earth, and then wrote it out of history in order to, one, ensure that people would believe that they were the original source of life in the universe, the first race to pop up, and two, to maintain their power and to protect the Life Entity, to keep an event like this from actually happening. It is designed to show the Guardians of the Universe as beings who are full of hubris, who believe that they legitimately have the right to decide how the universe should progress. And so it basically would have brought the entire foundation of what it is that made the Guardians of the Universe as they are crashing down around them, and people would have just lost trust in them entirely, not to mention the Green Lantern Corps probably would have vacated. But more so than that, the Life Entity is the representation of life in the DC universe. And if somebody harnesses that power, they would become God. And that's the fear that the Guardians of the Universe have. That if people knew the Life Entity exists, it would be like this great gold rush for the power of the Life Entity. It could potentially even usher in this massive universal civil war of people who were coveting all this power. And whoever came out on top, no matter what their intentions were, they would be virtually unstoppable. And so in this instance, where Hal Jordan rationalizes and says, okay, well, we have to seize the power of the Life Entity in order to basically destroy Necron and the Black Lantern Corps, Val Sinestro steps in. And Val Sinestro says, no, you have Parallax, I get the Life Entity. And so what we end up having here is basically the rise of the first White Lantern in the form of Val Sinestro, who seizes the power of the Life Entity itself. Okay, so picking up with the conclusion of Blackest Night, we're finally here, we're finally done.
That's looking pretty damn good.
The story's lengthy. Brightest Day is even longer. The cool thing
Basically base coated everything I need. So I'm just going to go over it again with some shading and some highlights and all that stuff. Alright, man, I will be back on later.